Why gas stations almost never make money on gas. The 2-cent margin that built a $53B industry. Here's what nobody tells you. The real fortune hidden inside America's gas station empire wasn't pumped out of the ground. It was built on something so small, so invisible, that most people drove past it their entire lives without ever noticing it was there. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why a business model that makes almost no money on its primary product became the foundation of a $553 billion industry. Stay with me, because I'm going to show you something at the end that will completely reframe how you think about the American fuel economy. If you've ever owned or operated a business, or if you've just been curious about how some of the most ordinary places in America actually work financially, this is the kind of rabbit hole that explains everything. The gas station isn't really about gas at all. And if you want to understand the complete financial architecture behind why that is, the real cost structures, the margin calculations, the psychological design of these spaces, there's a full guide available in the description and pinned comment that breaks down every mechanism I'm talking about today. That's where the deep work lives. But here's the thing we need to establish right away. Wait, this part is critical. In the 1970s, when America's gas station infrastructure was truly at its peak, the average profit margin on a gallon of gasoline was something between 2 and 4 cents. Think about that for a second. A customer would pull up, spend $4 or $5 to fill a 15-gallon tank, and the station owner's take-home from that transaction was somewhere between 30 cents and 60 cents. That's the entire profit on the main product. That's it. And yet by 1980 there were roughly 170,000 gas stations operating across America. How does that even happen? The answer sits at the exact intersection of two things: razor-thin margins on fuel, and the almost accidental discovery that you could make a small fortune on everything else. But before we go deeper into the math, I want to hear from you. Have you ever worked at a gas station or watched someone in your family run one? I know there are viewers who remember the actual day-to-day reality of these places. The conversations with regulars, the sound of the bell when someone drove over the hose, the smell of the oil and the receipt paper. Leave a comment and tell me what your memory of the local station was like. And please, subscribe to stay with me as we walk through the complete financial story of why these places mattered so much, and what they reveal about American consumer psychology. Now, the reason this matters, the reason we're exploring this at all, is that the gas station became one of America's most perfect teaching tools for understanding how thin-margin, high-volume businesses actually survive, and more than that, how they transform into something else entirely once you understand the real product. Let's start with the brutal economics. In the post-World War II era, American gasoline was cheap. The oil majors, Mobil, Shell, Texaco, Standard Oil, Gulf, controlled the wholesale price, and independent operators who wanted to run a station had to buy at that wholesale rate. If wholesale gasoline cost the station owner 27 cents per gallon and he could sell it at the pump for 29 or 30 cents, his gross margin was 2 or 3 cents per gallon. Volume was everything. A station might pump 3.000 gallons a day during peak years. That meant $60 to $120 a day in fuel margin. Before rent, before an attendant's wages, before utilities, before the mortgage or the lease payment on the station building itself. Most historians and economists stop there. They look at those numbers and say, impossible. How did anyone make money? And that's where they miss the entire story. The station that barely made money on gasoline was actually a real estate play. It was a destination. Every single day, hundreds or thousands of people came to that property to do one thing: buy fuel. And once they were there, they were captive. They had a few minutes to wait, or they were sitting at a pump waiting for an attendant, or they had just finished filling up and were walking to the office to pay. What happened in those moments of captivity became the real business. The convenience store didn't invent the convenience store model. The gas station did. Think about the genius of this from a pure business perspective. You have a location where you're already losing money on your primary product. You're running a loss leader, and not intentionally. You're stuck with it. The only rational response is to fill every inch of available space and every moment of customer attention with things that actually have margin. Motor oil had a markup of maybe 40 or 50%. A cup of coffee, if you offered it, had a markup of 300% or higher. Cigarettes carried 15 to 20% markup. Windshield washer fluid, antifreeze, brake fluid, air filters, maps, snacks, soda, candy. Every single one of these items had a margin that made the fuel look like charity. And here's where it gets interesting. The station owner didn't set out to run a convenience store, he set out to run a fuel business. But the margins destroyed him until he was forced to think about what else he could sell. By the 1960s, the smartest operators understood a fundamental truth. The station was a retail location first, and a fuel pump second. The fuel was the traffic driver, everything else was the profit center. This is where the money actually lived. And station owners who understood this principle survived. Those who didn't. By the early 1960s, a typical full-service station in a mid-sized American town carried anywhere from $4 to $8.00000 in inventory at any given time. That's not fuel, that's merchandise. Oil cans, batteries, fan belts, hoses, spark plugs, floor mats, seat covers, air fresheners, tire repair kits, jumper cables. In the station office or in a small room behind the pumps, you'd find a locked cabinet with engine additives, carburetor cleaner, and specialty lubricants that cost the station owner $1.02 to stock, but sold for $1.08 or $2.02. A customer comes in with engine trouble, the attendant talks him through it, and suddenly a 3-cent margin on 10 gallons of gas has been offset by a 40% margin on a $2.00 bottle of oil treatment. But there's a deeper principle at work here, and it's one that separated the thriving stations from the ones that closed. Location and customer psychology. A gas station, unlike a grocery store or a department store, trapped the customer. You pulled in because you needed fuel. You had to wait. While you waited, while your car was being filled, or while you sat in the car, you were captive. You could walk into the station office, use the restroom, grab a cold drink from the cooler, buy a pack of cigarettes. The station owner who grasped this understood that he wasn't competing with the station down the street on fuel price. He was competing on experience and convenience. Some of the most successful operators installed larger restrooms, clean, well-lit, with attendants who checked them hourly. Some added small waiting areas with chairs and a radio. Some stocked better candy selections, fresher coffee, newer magazines. A few even added small snack counters that made hot dogs or sandwiches. These were deliberate choices to extend the time the customer spent in or around the station, and every minute of dwell time increased the likelihood of a purchase in that high-margin merchandise section. The real innovation came in the 1950s and accelerated through the 1960s. The self-service pump. This fundamentally changed the economics of the station. Before self-service, every gallon of fuel required an attendant's labor. That attendant had to walk to the pump, insert the nozzle, clean the windshield, check the oil, and make conversation with the customer. In a busy station, an attendant could pump perhaps 80 to 120 gallons per hour, depending on how many cars arrived simultaneously. Self-service stations, by contrast, could move 200 to 300 gallons per hour with the same attendant count because the customer was doing the work. This sounds like a simple efficiency gain, but it created an enormous strategic problem for the full-service operator. Self-service stations could undercut fuel prices more aggressively because their cost per gallon was lower, but they also eliminated the personal touchpoint, the moment when an attendant could recommend an oil change, suggest a tire rotation, or upsell a quart of coolant. The self-service model forced the operator to rely entirely on the convenience store merchandise to offset thin margins. And here's where it gets interesting. Before we continue, I want to make sure you catch the full pattern of how this evolved. The economic forces that destroyed margins weren't random. They were built into the system from the beginning. Our complete in-depth guide on how stations structured their financials, where the hidden costs really lived, and why the margin compression happened the way it did, is available in the description and pinned in the comments. This guide goes deep into the actual ledgers and cost structures, the kind of detail that tells you exactly how station owners thought about money and inventory. If you want to understand the mechanics behind this shift, that's where the real keys are. Now back to what was happening. The self-service revolution happened because of labor costs. An attendant in 1955 cost a station owner roughly $0.90 per hour in wages. By 1965, that had climbed to $1.40. By 1975, it was pushing $3.50 per hour. Labor inflation was relentless. A busy full-service station with 4 pumps operating simultaneously needed at least 2 attendants during peak hours. That meant $6 to $7 per hour just in wages, not counting payroll taxes, insurance, or uniforms. Over a year, with a typical station operating 16 hours per day, 365 days a year, labor was consuming $3.500 to $4.000 of the annual revenue. For a station that might gross $1.50 to $2.00 in fuel sales, labor was eating 18 to 27% of the top line. A full-service station owner in 1970 faced a brutal choice. He could try to maintain the full-service model and watch his labor costs consume his margins, or he could convert to self-service and accept lower fuel volumes but higher margins on merchandise. Some tried to split the difference, keeping one or two full-service pumps for older customers or premium fuel while adding self-service bays. Others abandoned full service entirely and invested in larger convenience sections, adding more coolers, more snacks, wider product selections. The smartest operators understood something crucial. The margin on fuel was never going to recover. It was only going to compress further. Oil companies themselves were consolidating, and they were beginning to experiment with company-operated stations and branded convenience concepts. Shell began rolling out its concept of Shell stations that emphasized the retail experience. Texaco invested in what they called Texaco Star Marts. These weren't just pumps. They were designed to be retail destinations. This created a new competitive landscape. The independent operator, the guy who owned one station or maybe three in a small town, was now competing not just with the station down the street but with the capital and supply chain of major oil companies. An independent station owner couldn't negotiate the kind of fuel prices that Shell or Esso could because he didn't have volume leverage. He couldn't match their inventory selection because he didn't have the logistics infrastructure. What he could do was compete on service, cleanliness, and personal relationships. In small towns, this mattered enormously. You knew the station owner, you knew the attendants by name, your car got attention. If you had a problem, the owner would personally help you troubleshoot it. This loyalty was worth something. It was worth a thin margin on fuel if it meant consistent volume. But in growing suburbs and urban areas, where mobility was increasing and brand recognition mattered more than personal connection, the independent station was already in decline by the late 1960s. The numbers tell the story clearly. In 1950, roughly 200,000 gas stations operated in the United States. By 1965, that number had fallen to 164,000. By 1975, it was 140,000. The number of gas stations was shrinking even as fuel consumption was skyrocketing. More cars, fewer stations. That means each surviving station was selling more volume, but it also means that the marginal, poorly positioned, or poorly managed stations were disappearing. Consolidation was happening in real time. For the station owner in 1965 or 1970, this created an impossible situation. He couldn't make meaningful money on fuel, his labor costs were rising, his margins on merchandise were decent but required inventory investment and management. He was competing with brands he couldn't match. And yet, fuel was still the reason customers came. It was still the traffic driver, so he couldn't abandon fuel sales, but he couldn't rely on them either. This tension between the necessity of low-margin fuel and the impossibility of profitable fuel sales is what defined the gas station business from the 1960s onward, and is the reason why the structure of the station, the design of the convenience section, the inventory decisions, and the labor model all mattered so intensely. Every decision flowed from this fundamental problem. What kept stations alive wasn't genius. It was arithmetic. If a station pumped 3.000 gallons per day at a 2-cent margin, that was $6.00 in gross profit on fuel. If that same station sold $4.00 worth of merchandise per day, and this was realistic in a busy location, at a 20% margin, that was $8.00 in gross profit. Suddenly, the merchandise was generating more profit than the fuel, even though it was a fraction of the sales volume. The merchandise was the profit engine. But here's the catch. Merchandise inventory has to be managed. Products have to be ordered, stocked, tracked, and sometimes rotated off shelves when they expire or become obsolete. If you order too much of something, you tie up capital in dead inventory. If you order too little, you disappoint customers and miss sales. Station owners had to become inventory managers whether they wanted to or not. Some of the most successful station owners in the 1960s and 1970s ran their merchandise sections like small convenience stores because that's essentially what they had become. They studied their customer demographics. They noticed which products moved quickly and which sat. They built relationships with local suppliers for fresh items like bread and milk if they had a cooler section. They tracked spoilage and waste carefully because waste directly cut into margins. A 10% spoilage rate on perishables could cut your merchandise margin from 20% to 18%, and over a year, that was hundreds of dollars. The real sophistication came in understanding transaction patterns. Certain times of the day, certain days of the week, and certain seasons generated predictable buying patterns. Commuters on their way to work in the morning bought coffee and cigarettes. Weekend drivers bought snacks and soft drinks. Cold weather drove sales of antifreeze and ice scrapers. Hot weather drove sales of coolant and air fresheners. A smart operator stocked accordingly and rotated merchandise seasonally to maximize turns and minimize waste. This sounds mundane, and it was, but it was also the difference between a station that made money and one that didn't. The stations that failed were often the ones where the owner treated merchandise as an afterthought, ordered sporadically, and didn't pay attention to what sold and what didn't. The stations that thrived were the ones where merchandise was treated as a core business with the same discipline as fuel sales. By the early 1970s, another factor began reshaping the station landscape: the Arab oil embargo. In October 1973, OPEC imposed an oil embargo on the United States and other nations that had supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Overnight, fuel prices spiked. The price of crude oil went from around $3 per barrel to $1.02 per barrel in a matter of weeks. Retail gasoline prices, which had been hovering around 35 to 40 cents per gallon, jumped to 55 cents, then 60 cents. For the first time in the post-war era, fuel scarcity became real. Gas lines formed, odd-even purchasing rules were implemented. You could only buy fuel on certain days depending on your license plate. The station owner, who had always operated on the assumption of steady supply and gradual price changes, suddenly faced rationing and volatility. This crisis, paradoxically, was a gift to independent station operators, at least temporarily. In a time of scarcity, brand loyalty and personal relationships mattered. Customers weren't shopping for the cheapest fuel, they were searching for fuel, period. A regular customer at a station the owner knew had a better chance of getting fuel during rationing, and when fuel became scarce, the markup briefly widened. Suppliers couldn't move volume, so they couldn't undercut each other. For a few months, that 2-cent margin briefly became 5 cents or higher. But the embargo also accelerated the transition to self-service. During the crisis, self-service stations could move fuel faster with the same or fewer attendants. The speed of turnover mattered when supply was constrained. And once the embargo lifted and fuel supply stabilized again, the infrastructure advantage had already shifted towards self-service operations. The full-service model, which required more labor per gallon, was clearly doomed. Station owners who had resisted the shift to self-service found themselves forced into it. Those who had already made the transition suddenly had a competitive advantage, and those who had invested in larger convenience sections found that merchandise sales became increasingly important to profitability as fuel margins continued to compress. By the late 1970s, the economics of the independent gas station had fundamentally changed from what it had been in 1960. The station owner was no longer primarily in the business of selling fuel, he was in the business of capturing convenience store traffic powered by fuel demand. The fuel was still essential. It was the draw, but the money came from elsewhere. This reality forced a new kind of thinking about station design and location. A station wasn't just a place to pump fuel anymore. It was a convenience destination. This meant that location mattered even more intensely than before. A station on a busy highway had advantages over a station in a quiet neighborhood, not just because of fuel volume, but because of the sheer foot traffic that could be converted into merchandise sales. A station near a highway exit, near a shopping center, or near a major intersection had multiple customer flows it could tap into. And the design of the station itself became critical. Larger windows in the convenience section, better lighting inside, wider aisles that felt less cramped, more coolers for beverages because cold drinks were a consistent margin driver, better signage advertising fuel prices on large roadside signs so that customers heading to an exit could see the price and make a decision. These weren't luxuries, they were necessities. The stations that looked dark, cramped, or poorly maintained lost customers to the ones that felt bright and inviting. This brings us to a crucial shift in how station operators thought about their business model. The gas station, by the late 1970s, had essentially become a franchise-ready concept. Major oil companies began realizing that the real opportunity wasn't in selling fuel. It was in controlling the retail real estate at the fuel-adjacent moment. They could build the station, set the standards, and collect a margin on the fuel and on the merchandise sold under their brand. The independent operator was being gradually pushed toward either becoming a branded affiliate or disappearing. The financial pressure was immense. To remain competitive with a branded station, an independent owner had to invest in his station's appearance, expand his convenience section, and maintain consistent inventory levels. This required capital. An independent station owner in 1975 might have spent $3 to $5 to modernize his station, add more coolers, expand the merchandise section, and install better lighting. For a small business owner operating on modest margins, this was a substantial investment that had to be financed through bank loans or personal savings. The branded stations, by contrast, were often built and financed by the oil company itself, which then leased the property and equipment to a franchisee or operator. The operator's investment was lower, but his autonomy was also lower. He had to follow company-set standards for merchandise selection, pricing, staffing, and appearance. But he got the benefit of oil company marketing, supply chain infrastructure, and brand recognition. This tension between the independence and capital burden of an independent station and the support but loss of control of a branded station defined the late 1970s and early 1980s for station owners. For many, the choice wasn't really a choice. Capital constraints made modernization impossible, so they gradually lost market share to branded competitors and eventually closed. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning of this video. The 2-cent margin on fuel didn't destroy the gas station business. It transformed it. The stations that survived and thrived weren't the ones that found ways to make money on fuel. They were the ones that accepted the fuel as a traffic driver and built an entirely separate profit center around convenience. The oil companies understood this shift faster than independent operators did, and that understanding gave them a massive competitive advantage that persisted for decades. The station owner who survived the 1960s and 1970s wasn't just a fuel dealer. He was a retailer who happened to sell fuel. This is why the structure of the business, the inventory systems, the labor model, the convenience section design, mattered so intensely. The margins on fuel were beyond his control, but the margins on merchandise and the efficiency of converting fuel traffic into merchandise sales were entirely his to optimize or mismanage. In the next part of this series, we're going to look at how this dynamic played out specifically in different station formats: the small-town independent, the suburban chain, and the highway mega station. Each had different economics, different customer bases, and different survival strategies. And each tells us something crucial about how American retail businesses adapted when their primary product became essentially unsellable at a profit. Thank you for staying with me through this deep dive into the financial mechanics of the gas station business. If you found value in understanding how a seemingly simple retail operation actually worked and how the margins forced owners to fundamentally reimagine their business, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this series. I'd also genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. Did you have a station you remember from your own experience? Was there a particular brand or local owner that stood out to you? Those personal connections are what make this history real. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we upload, and I'll see you in the next video. Now here is where the real story gets interesting, because understanding margin on gasoline alone tells you almost nothing about why gas stations survived, let alone why they became one of the most durable business models in American commerce. The margin on fuel was thin, yes, but the station itself was a trap, a beautiful, profitable trap, designed to capture you the moment you pulled up. The convenience items, these were the real profit engine. A pack of cigarettes that cost the station owner 40 cents wholesale? He sold it for 65 cents. That's a 40% margin. A candy bar purchased for 30 cents? Marked up to 55 cents. Nearly 100% margin. A cup of coffee made for 5 cents in labor and materials? Sold for 25 cents. These items, stocked inside that small office or behind that counter, generated the actual cash that kept the station alive. By the 1960s and 1970s, a well-operated gas station could draw gross margins of 15 to 18% on the convenience side of the business. That doesn't sound enormous, and it wasn't. But spread across 100 or 200 transactions a day, across cigarettes, soda, magazines, snacks, and windshield washer fluid, it added up to survival. Some stations ran numbers showing that convenience and service revenues represented 30 to 40% of their total gross profit, even though fuel was 90% of their volume. This is why service mattered so much. Full-service stations, where an attendant came out, pumped your gas, checked your oil, washed your windshield, and sometimes handled minor repairs inside a small bay, weren't offering luxury. They were maximizing the opportunity cost of your visit. Every moment you stood at that pump was a chance to sell you something else. Every car that pulled in was a customer in a slightly captive state. They needed fuel. Once they were there, they might buy a drink, a pack of cigarettes, maybe a quart of oil. And here is the crucial detail that most people overlook. The station owner was running a cash business. Every transaction was immediate. Money changed hands. There was no waiting 30, 60, or 90 days for a payment. That cash flow, even if the margins were tight, gave the owner immediate purchasing power. He could restock his cigarettes and candy with next week's cash. He could cover payroll. He could handle repairs. The fuel business generated traffic. The convenience business generated immediate cash. Before we continue deeper into how this model actually scaled, because it did scale, and scale in remarkable ways, I want to pause here for a moment. There is something fundamental about how independent gas station owners understood their own business that rarely makes it into the economic literature. And if you want to understand not just the numbers, but the actual thinking, the actual strategic choices, the actual tension between what oil companies demanded and what owners could actually sustain, that is all mapped out in our complete guide to the hidden mechanics of the gas station economy. You'll find it in the description and pinned comment. It goes far deeper than what I can cover here, and it is essential reading if you want to truly understand how these machines worked. The real tension in the gas station business emerged not from the fuel margins themselves. Those were understood, accepted, even expected to be tight, but from the relationship between the station owner and the oil company supplier. Most gas stations, especially by the 1950s and forward, were not independently owned refineries. They were branded franchises. An owner signed a lease with an oil company, or a lease with a jobber, a middleman who had rights to distribute that company's fuel in a particular territory. The oil company controlled the pump, the sign, the branding, the supply. The owner controlled the building, the convenience items, and the service operations. This created a structural problem. The oil company had no incentive to care whether your station made money. They made money on every gallon you pumped, regardless of whether you covered your costs or not. In fact, the oil companies, especially the major integrated companies like Exxon, Mobil, and Standard Oil, were far more concerned with market share and volume than with the health of individual franchise operators. They would rather oversupply a territory with stations knowing some would fail than leave any potential gallon of fuel unsold. By the late 1970s, this tension had become acute. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 had sent fuel prices spiraling upward. Suddenly, the margin on a gallon of gas, which had been a predictable 1 to 2 cents per gallon, was no longer stable. Prices at the pump began to fluctuate week to week. The federal government instituted price controls, creating even more confusion. Station owners found themselves in the bizarre position of potentially being unable to buy fuel at the regulated price they were allowed to charge. A station owner in 1974 was not in the same economic situation as a station owner in 1964. The business had fundamentally shifted. For 10 or 15 years before the embargo, a small independent operator could reasonably expect consistent margins, predictable costs, and a steady cash flow from convenience items. The model worked. But when external forces, geopolitical events beyond anyone's control, suddenly altered the input cost, the fragile balance collapsed. This is where the story intersects with something larger about American retail. The gas station business, as it had been constructed in the post-war decades, relied on a stable cost structure and predictable consumer behavior. Full-service stations, with attendants and service bays, required significant labor costs. A station owner in 1970 might employ 3 to 5 people during a shift. Payroll was often the largest operating expense after fuel cost of goods sold. When fuel costs remained stable and volume remained steady, you could absorb that payroll into your 15 to 18% convenience margin and break even or make a modest profit. But what happened when fuel costs spiked? Suddenly your cost of goods sold, which had been 43 or 44% of revenue, jumped to 50 or 51%. Your margin on fuel didn't shrink. There was no margin on fuel to begin with. But your payroll stayed the same. Your rent stayed the same. Your utilities stayed the same. Suddenly, instead of a station generating 5 to 8% net profit on total revenue, you were generating 1 to 2%, or worse, operating at a loss. Owners began to respond. The first response was what you might expect: reduce labor. Self-service pumps, which had existed since the 1950s but were a minority offering, suddenly became attractive. Yes, customers didn't like them as much. They preferred the convenience and security of having someone else pump their gas. But from an owner's perspective, a self-service pump eliminated 1 or 2 positions. Overnight, you cut payroll by 20 to 30%. You could absorb the spike in fuel costs. The second response was to expand convenience offerings and reduce the service component. If full service generated a 2% net margin and was getting squeezed by fuel costs, what if you eliminated the service bay entirely, eliminated the oil checks and windshield washes, and instead invested in a larger convenience store? A 700 square foot convenience area with better lighting, more products, higher margins on snacks and beverages? By the early 1980s, the full-service, high-labor, low-convenience gas station was already becoming obsolete. It was not killed by a single innovation, it was killed by mathematics. The business model that had worked, thin fuel margins offset by healthy service and convenience revenues, could not survive when input costs became volatile and when the structural relationship between the station owner and the oil company supplier made the owner absorb all the risk while the supplier captured most of the upside. This evolution reveals something fundamental about how American businesses adapted or failed to adapt to changing economics in the post-war period. The gas station was not a business failure waiting to happen. It was a perfectly functional economic machine until the machine's inputs changed. When they did, the owners who survived were the ones who could recognize the change quickly and restructure their operation accordingly. Those who couldn't, or who were locked into franchise agreements that didn't allow them the flexibility to adapt, simply closed. And yet, and this is important, the gas station itself never disappeared. What disappeared was a particular version of it. The model evolved. The low-margin fuel-focused station gave way to the convenience store-focused station. Fuel became the traffic driver, not the profit driver. The profit came from coffee, energy drinks, prepared food, lottery tickets, and increasingly, in the 1990s and 2000s, from payment processing and other financial services. The station owner of 1990 was running a different business than the station owner of 1960, even though they both pumped gasoline. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning, the part of the gas station story that transforms it from a simple tale about thin margins into something far more complex and revealing about American business. The 2-cent margin on gasoline did not build the $553 billion industry despite its thinness. It built the industry precisely because of its thinness. The thin margin forced owners to innovate constantly, to find new ways to capture profit, to adapt their operations to changing input costs and consumer behavior. The margin itself was almost a forcing function, a structural requirement that pushed the industry toward efficiency, density, and continuous optimization. A grocery store or a restaurant could operate on a fat margin and become complacent. A gas station couldn't. The structure of the business forced constant pressure to do more with less, to move faster, to capture every transaction, to expand the basket. That pressure over decades created a business model that is remarkably resilient and adaptable. Gas stations are still here, they still pump gasoline, but they have evolved far beyond that simple function. And that is when everything changed. Not overnight, but slowly, across the 1980s and into the 1990s, gas stations began to understand something crucial. The gasoline itself, that narrow margin, that 2 to 3 cents per gallon, was not the story anymore. It was the foundation. It was the reason people stopped. But what happened inside the station, in those minutes while the tank filled, was where the real money lived. The convenience store attached to the pump became the profit engine. A bag of chips cost the station owner maybe 40 cents wholesale. It sells for $1.50. $1. $75,002 in a busy location. That is a 75 to 80% markup. A fountain drink, syrup, cups, ice, costs perhaps 15 cents to serve. The price? $3, $4, sometimes more. A hot dog spinning under those orange heat lamps all day costs roughly 60 cents in meat and bun. The sale price? No $50 to $3.50. These are not 2-cent margins, these are business class economics. By the year 2000, the average gas station was earning between 40 and 60% of its gross profit from inside the store, not from the pumps. The pumps were the draw. The store was the profit. A station that sold 3.000 gallons of gas a day at a 2-cent margin earned about $6 in gross profit from fuel. But if those same customers spent an average of $7 inside, a coffee, a snack, a drink, the station earned an additional $1 to $1. $500 in gross margin from convenience sales. The math is stark. The business had inverted. This transformation saved the gas station industry. It did. Because gasoline margins were compressing further, not from 2 cents to 1 cent, but the volume demanded by major oil companies only increased. Wholesale prices fluctuated wildly. The squeeze was relentless. But the convenience store model created a buffer. It created a secondary revenue stream that was not volatile, not commoditized, not dependent on crude oil prices. It was pure, high-margin retail. Today, a typical gas station in America makes roughly 70 to 80 cents per gallon sold in gross margin. but only 2 to 5 cents of that comes from the fuel itself. The rest, the bulk of it, comes from cigarettes, lottery, alcohol, energy drinks, snacks, coffee, and car washes. Some large chains report that convenience store sales represent 55 to 60% of their total revenue. The pumps are the marketing department, the store is the business. And here is where the 2-cent margin becomes profound. It was not a limitation, it was a filter. The thinness of that margin eliminated any competitor who was not ruthlessly efficient, operationally disciplined, and obsessively focused on asset utilization. Small, independent stations struggled not because they could not sell gas. They could, but because they could not operate at the scale and efficiency required to survive on a 2-cent margin. Only large companies with supply chain advantages, purchasing power, and the capital to build and maintain dozens of stations could make the numbers work. The system, in other words, was self-selecting. It chose scale. It chose corporations. It chose standardization. And that choice was baked into the 2-cent margin. A mom-and-pop operator with 1 or 2 station locations could not leverage supplier agreements the way Chevron or Shell could. They could not negotiate lower wholesale prices. They could not build an economy of scale in their convenience store operations. They were competing on thin margins with a disadvantage built into the very structure of the business. Over time, independent gas stations disappeared. In 1970, roughly 60% of gas stations in America were independent operators or small chains. By 2010, that number had fallen to below 20%. Today, it is lower still. The consolidation was not a scandal or a surprise. It was the inevitable outcome of a business model structured around minimal margins and maximal efficiency. The 2-cent margin did not just build the $5.53 billion industry. It built the industry's monopoly. It determined who could compete. It determined who could survive. But the real secret, the one I promised you at the beginning, is this. The gas station is not a fuel business. It never was. It is a real estate business with a fuel convenience. The land is valuable because it is positioned on a high-traffic corridor. The location creates captive demand. And that captive demand, the moment when a driver must stop, is the moat around the entire operation. Every gas station in America occupies a strategic position on the map. It is there because thousands of people pass it every day. It is there because a developer, decades ago, understood that a corner lot on a busy boulevard could support a fuel station, because fuel was a necessity that brought people reliably to that spot. The developer made money on the real estate. The operator makes money on the convenience store. The system works because the 2-cent margin ensured that only disciplined, efficient, scaled operators could acquire and hold these locations. Bad operators failed. Land passed to better operators. The real estate sorted itself into the hands of those most capable of extracting value from it. This is why gas stations seem to be everywhere and nowhere, why you can find one on almost any major road, but why their individual locations are not random. They are positioned because each position was fought over, acquired, and held by operators who understood that location, not fuel, not service, but location, was the actual commodity being traded. The 2-cent margin forced companies to understand this. It forced them to optimize. It forced them to scale, and in doing so it created a real estate network that has become as embedded in American infrastructure as the interstate highway system itself. And this is the takeaway: if you want to understand American business, understand the gas station. Because the gas station is a perfect, almost brutal distillation of how capitalism works. A thin margin that eliminates the weak, a necessary product that generates traffic, a captive moment that becomes an opportunity to sell something else. Real estate as the true asset. Efficiency as survival, scale as dominance. The 2-cent margin built the industry because it forced the industry to become something far larger and more sophisticated than anyone could have imagined in 1920. It was not a limitation, it was a directive. The next time you stop to fill your tank, look around. Notice the convenience store. Notice the prices on the snacks, the drinks, the cigarettes. Notice how the space is designed to keep you there just long enough to spend an extra $5 or $10. That is not accident. That is the invisible architecture of a business model that has survived and thrived for a century because it understood, long before most industries did, that the margin on your core product might be razor thin, but the margin on everything else, on the location, on the moment, on the captive attention, can be enormous. That is the secret the 2-cent margin taught America. Thank you for watching. If you are curious about how other American institutions solve the margin problem, how drive-in theaters, small-town newspapers, and country clubs navigated their own razor-thin economics, I would encourage you to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss a new video. And if this investigation into the hidden machinery behind gas stations sparked something for you, I would love to hear it in the comments below. What was your experience at a gas station? What do you remember about them? Leave a comment. The conversation is where these stories come alive. Until next time.